Chandwell finally has its signal box. Based on a mix of the boxes that used to stand at Guiseley and at Ilkley, this signal box is made from card, paper, sticky labels and chocolate cake packaging. And because it's N-gauge, it's also quite small. Welcome to Chandwell. My name's Michael and I'm scratch building this imagined grotty part of Yorkshire set in 1993. Join me as we take a look at how I approached scratch building a signal box. It's been almost a year since I decided on where to place the signal box. I decided that an elevated box with a double overhang would work really well at the end of the platform. There was just such a box a few miles from where I live, and I was surprised when I realised that the box still exists at the Empsey and Bolton Abbey Steam Railway just 10 miles down the road. I went over to have a look and did my best to take measurements. I used my iPad's LiDAR sensor to take accurate enough measurements even though I could not get too close to the box. Using a combination of hand spans and measurements of two separate signal boxes, I patched together the dimensions as best I could. I drew simple shapes in the free drawing application Inkscape, and slowly a design for the signal box came to life. I printed the sides of the base onto A4 sticky labels. Labels are great as you can stick them straight to the card and start cutting without waiting for glue to dry. I printed 2 copies of the shapes. I stuck the shapes onto card, 1 copy onto 0.5mm card and 1 copy to 1mm card. This allows me to embed the windows without them appearing too deep in the walls, but also keep the walls nice and sturdy. I cut the shapes out with a Swan Morton scalpel with a 10A blade. I used many light strokes to keep the cutting easy and the lines straight and perpendicular. I was left with the components all cut out neatly in pairs. One wall had windows and one a door, but the other 2 walls could just be glued together back to back. I used PVA for this and I am left with walls 1.5mm thick. I tested clearance at this point as I didn't want any nasty surprises later on. I used PVA to butt the 2 completed walls together. I held them at right angles using these excellent magnetic clamps from York Model Making. I used the sticky label method for window frames. The frames are printed onto sticky label and then stuck to the acetate that surrounded a supermarket chocolate cake. This is then crisscrossed with the scalpel on either edge of the 1/4mm window frames. You're left with a kind of grid that you then just pull out the insides of with the tip of the scalpel blade. This leaves a lovely delicate window frame, which fits the holes in the 0.5mm card perfectly. I made a video about this technique and there is a link to it in the description of this video. I use a black pen to colour the inside wall behind the windows, and then use a scale model scenery right angle jig to hold the pieces in place and add it to the model. I found a picture of Ilkley box taken in the early 90s just before it was pulled down and copied the signs on the door. This was printed with a simple graduated colour fill and simple lines to represent planks. It goes behind this hole just right. It gets glued onto the 1mm backing and then added to the building in the jig using PVA glue. It was essential to get this part as square as possible. A couple of engineer's squares and little clamps helped keep it all aligned as the glue went off. This looks good. Because the outer texture wraps go onto the surface across the joints, it's important to get them as level as possible. I used a cheap nail file to smooth off the joins. I created a simple painted plank texture using individual rectangles with graduated fills. Graduated red rectangles represented the frames. I usually fold the texture around the edges, but this time I wanted the edge to be as crisp as possible, so I was adding them as 4 individual pieces. I used a red pen to colour the paper to remove the white edge. This then drops on here and fits perfectly. I repeat this all the way around, using PVA to affix the textures and get them all aligned. I like using PVA as it does not grip immediately. It gives you a few precious seconds to slide it into the exact position. I wanted the frame to look a little more 3D than just printed paper, so I printed it all again and cut the frame pieces separately. The paper is very delicate, but I coloured each edge with the red pen, and then used my tweezers to drop the piece exactly into position on a thin line of PVA. I repeated this for all of the other frame elements. The door frame was less than 1mm thick. Oops. I got it on in the end though. I cut 2 rectangles and glued them together to represent a 1.5mm thick base. I wrapped this with simple red edges that folded round, and this makes a base for the box proper. And in place, it looks like the beams that hold it all up. The real thing has a separate wooden walkway around the bottom of the windows. I decided to model it as part of the main structure though, as making it separate would be too fiddly in N-gauge. I cut the floor from 0.5mm card, and then wrapped it with a simple wooden texture that I downloaded from textures.com. Once folded round, it looks like a thin plank-based walkway that overhangs the base just right. I left a white line to help me align the main box walls properly. The box itself is mainly window. I printed the wall structure to sticky labels, and I was concerned by just how thin those supports looked. I started to very carefully cut out the large holes for the windows. I was left with 4 extremely delicate and flimsy wall components on 0.5mm card. These elements here are less than 1mm thick. I used 2 jigs to glue them together in right angle pairs. Then, once the glue was set, I joined these together along one edge. I left this edge loose so I could get it exactly right once the 3 other edges were stuck fast. Once done, it was a simple case of drawing a line of glue along the guideline and then dropping the flimsy frame into place. I coloured the card edges with the red pen to represent the painted window frame surrounds. Neither of the 2 real boxes at Guiseley and Ilkley had windows on the back wall, but the position of the box in Chandwell meant that it should have some visibility out the back. I'd seen an example of a Midland box with windows all round, but it also had a walkway right around, and I didn't want that. This is because I love the characterful porch of the Guiseley box. I decided therefore to have the back wall only half glazed. Midland signal boxes were characterised by their windows with the little triangles at the top corners. Before I started, I had no idea whether my sticky label method would work with these. I also observed that they were affixed in pairs, one in front of the other, to allow sliding them open. I thought I could make this look good and also solve the flimsy wall problem by adapting the sticky label technique a little. I cut the acetate to the same size as the entire wall, and I cut 2 pieces per wall. Each piece contained either the front or the back window, and I cut a hole where the other window would be. Once placed on top of each other, you get a lovely subtle 3D look that really does suggest one window being behind the other. The whole components slot into place inside the walls. I held these in place with clamps for the glue to set, and you're left with a sturdy wall made from 2 layers of acetate and 1 of card. The outer texture is added the same way as before. By positioning the windows slightly offset from each other and cutting 2 holes in one of the layers, you're left with a convincing depiction of one of the windows being slid open. And this effect even looks good from the inside of the box. The door was added separately before being glued into place. The inside is made even better by adding an inner layer of textured paper to represent the inside walls. This looks better than I ever imagined it would. I tried and failed to work out the exact roof pitch of Midland signal boxes, so I drew it just so that it felt kind of right. From the drawing, I use a really simple technique to get the shapes right for the hipped roof. This needs no maths or computer software, and I made a video about this that's linked in the description. The 4 sides of the roof simply drop together on a supporting triangle using PVA glue. To represent the painted frame, I coloured the edge of a rectangle of card with the red pen. That will go on top like this. I did the same again with the black pen on a larger rectangle. This will represent the guttering and will go on top like this. I used strips of scale seen slate roof tiles to tile the roof, and then finish it off with some ridging tiles. I decided to add the impression of an interior. I used photos of Ilkley Box as well as Bradford Mill Lane Junction from the 1990s that I found in books and online. Mill Lane is the track plan that inspired Chandwell, so I think it's quite a good fit. I knocked together a very simple representation of the signalling panel using simple rectangles. I used the real Chandwell control panel to represent the track diagram. It's not prototypically coloured and it's facing the wrong way, but I'm sure you'll forgive me. I decided to make a notice board for the back wall. It's full of important notices and announcements. track plan and notice board were just glued back to back with another sheet of paper, and then attached into place with PVA after drawing around the white edges with black pen. The panel and desks were glued to 0.5mm card and roughly assembled before being dropped into place. I want to say thank you to friend of the channel, Ian. Ian helped me out by sending me photos that he and his dad had taken of West Yorkshire signal boxes in the 1990s, but he also painted some figures for me recently. One of them has been added to the signal box to represent the signalman looking through the open window. I am really pleased with how the interior looks, even though it's never really going to be seen. It didn't take much effort, and it looks convincing enough for Engage. I used a line of PVA glue and dropped the roof on top, sealing the inside forever. The final part of the roof was to chop the ends off a cocktail stick and stick them to the roof to represent the pointed finials common to Midland signal boxes. I cut out a shape representing the exterior edges of the walking platform, and I glued this to a 1mm card base. I had this nickel silver rod kicking round from a project abandoned over 12 years ago. My plan was to bend it around the jig I'd just made. It was a tricky job, but with my crochet hook and a bit of patience, I managed to get there. I taped it into place and then used flux and solder to add upright lengths to represent the posts. I was left with a convincing enough railing which could be added to the box. Sadly, I have no video of me attempting to add this to the signal box. It was possibly the most frustrating thing I've ever tried to model. It took over 45 minutes after drilling little holes with a pin vise. I just couldn't get the posts into the holes without them popping out of the holes I'd already done. The wire kept springing away and at one point damaged a window frame, but I got there in the end and I used a bit of super glue to hold it in place. I drew the staircase in Inkscape and printed a silhouette of the sides onto sticky label. I stuck this to card and then held 3 strips of chocolate cake packaging acetate above it with tape. I cut another thin strip of acetate to represent the posts, and then used the tiniest blobs of superglue to hold them in place above the template. I ran my blade underneath to prevent any sticking to the card. I simply trimmed the excess with my scalpel. I ended up with a convincing enough looking railing. A quick check for fit and I was happy. I printed the strings onto sticky labels and stuck these to a bit of Weetabix packet. Weetabix box is great. It's very thin but very sturdy card. Absolutely perfect for this kind of thing. I cut down the tops of the stairs with my scalpel and then cut the piece out. It's tiny and I can barely hold it, but it is satisfying to then chop out the little triangles and watch them ping off onto the floor. I'm left with a little string of 19 steps, which I glue to the railing section with a bit of PVA. I keep it pressed against my ruler to ensure a straight fit. I paint the whole thing with acrylic paint at this point. Each step is absolutely tiny. They're less than 5mm wide by less than 1.5mm deep. To get them cut accurately, I print a strip with folding and cutting guides. I score down the centre line and then glue and fold the steps in half. This leaves me with a strip that is coloured on both sides and with a coloured front edge. The glued and folded paper bends a little, so I stick it to my mat with tape to keep it straight. I chop the steps into slices and then use the cutting guide to cut them all off in one go. This leaves a little pile of tiny steps ready to add to the strings. I do this one at a time with a dab of PVA and some tweezers. The glue holds the steps in place because they are so light. Once done, I set them aside for the glue to dry. I put the other side of the staircase onto my right-angled jig and then carefully arrange the steps beside it. I apply a little pressure with an engineer's square. I had no idea how this would look when I took it out. But yes, I am pleased with this. The lovely pristine signal box looked far too clean for Chandwell, so I used Humbrol weathering powder and very gently brushed it into the model with a soft brush. I applied it heavily into the recesses and then let gravity make it drift down. A bit of PVA to place the box into position. A test for clearance and a touch-up of paint. what did this build cost me? Let's see. I used 1 sheet of 0.5mm card, half a sheet of 1mm card, 2 sheets of sticky labels, 1 sheet of photo inkjet paper, 1 10A blade, a bit of chocolate cake acetate, 1 cocktail stick, half a nickel silver rod, a bit of glue, solder, paint, tape and pen, and the printer ink too. In all, I don't think that this signal box has cost even £1.50 for me to make. Maybe a bit more than that, if we take into account the cost of the plastic figure, which Ian gave me. This signal box looks exactly like I imagined in my mind's eye. It has echoes of Ilkley Box and Guiseley Box, and it is a perfect fit for the location and time period of Chandwell. I really hope that this lengthy video has been of interest, and I hope that it has been of some inspiration to you. Please do continue to join me at Chandwell as I scratch build my way through the town. I'm moving on to Station Road at the front of the layout now, where there will be many more scratch building challenges to come, starting with a curved fronted hotel based on the Crescent in Ilkley. I've been sharing almost daily progress photos of the signal box with my channel members. If you're interested in becoming a member, you can use this button here. And here's a look at one of the first buildings I made, the Weir pub down on Bridge Lane. So until my next video, thank you for watching, stay safe, and I'll see you next time.